The following presentation will explore the representation of mind and body in Villette 1853. The outline that I'm going to take is I'm going to address phrenology and physiognomy and relate this to interpreting the material body. I'll then look at chapter 15, which is the long vacation, and that shows a mind and body collapse of Lucy. And I will thirdly look at diagnosis and treatment of physical and mental disorders and show how this can be problematic. So physiognomy is referred to initially in volume 1, chapter 2 of Villette. However, it's a reoccurring thing throughout the novel. Phrenology may be defined as the study where the surface of the skull can be read as an accurate index of psychological aptitudes and tendencies, whereas physiognomy is the study of the features of the face or the form of the body generally as being supposedly indicative of character. So, although there is a distinction, they both work on the premise that the material body can be read and deciphered and that we can make inferences about the internal disposition of the character. So Paul is initially instructed by Madame de Bec, and she says, "I want your opinion. We know your skill in physiognomy. Use it now and read that countenance." And Lucy is hired based on what he reads of her facial features. And Miriam Bailyn states that the process that Paul engages in here is indicative of the hope that the material world, i.e. the body in this case, could provide a fully expressive, unmediated language of our inner nature. And so his reading is considered to be authoritative, and she is hired as a result of this. However, Lucy is not only the recipient of this, but she actually carries out a study herself. And she adopts the role of the spectator throughout the novel. There's a critic called Elle May, and she notes that there are 175 occasions throughout the novel when characters will assess somebody and then make a judgment of their character just by looking at them. And on 5 of those occasions, physiognomy is mentioned by name. This is one where Lucy looks at Paul, and she says that she could not be blind to certain vigorous characteristics of his physiognomy: the deep intent keenness of his eye, the power of his forehead, pale, broad and full, and the mobility of his flexible mouth. So Paul, in this instance, rather than carrying out the gaze, he is the subject on it, so it sort of works both ways. I'm now going to sort of move on and look at chapter 15, which is Long Vacation, and it's where we see a mind-body collapse of Lucy. Stephen Millhouse, who's a critic, notes that it's the most powerful evocation of anguish loneliness in English fiction. And I think the quotation at the bottom is most important because he says that it's a succession of physical and mental eruptions. So initially Lucy is kept occupied by looking after what she terms the cretin. And so her mind and body are engaged in this act. And Sue Chaplin notes that the mothering role Lucy fulfilled here prevents her from sinking into absolute despair. This is an idea that Barbara Lee Smith picks up on in Course Reader on her article, which is Women and Work. And she says that idleness is the state of tens of thousands of young women in Britain, and in consequence, disease is rife amongst them. So I think that says it's not necessarily surprising that Lucy's spirits begin to sink when her crop of employment, she calls it, is withdrawn, and she doesn't have anything to keep her sort of occupied physically or mentally, and her spirits begin to sink and she falls into despair. So our first sort of main indication is where we see the effect that the environment, the natural environment, has upon Lucy. She says that the environment makes a cruel impression upon her, and the raging storm and beating rain crushed her with a deadlier paralysis than she would experience while the air remained serene. And so what we see here is an inner crisis which she can't sort of rouse herself out of, and her feeling of paralysis is not physical, but it is within the mind, and she feels almost trapped within sort of her being. In an apparent attempt to release herself from this state of paralysis, which I've just noted. She often wanders out on her own in quite dangerous situations. She's in a mix of sort of hallucination at some points, and her body is described as very weak and shaking. And this is an idea that Anne Thackeray Ritchie picks up on in Heroines and Their Grandmothers in The Coarse Reader. And she notes that in the melancholy novel, we would be presented with women who would sit in their drawing room, instead of sitting in their drawing room, would be lying on their beds with agonising headaches, walking desperately along the streets, they know not whither, or staring out of windows in blank despair. And I think that's an idea that we can see with Lucy as she goes out from Bring Alone, and she goes to the confessional. Despite the fact that she's a Protestant, she attends Catholic confessional because she just needs that desire for human interaction and communication. The idea that Anne Thackeray notes as well, the idea that you're getting lost and the mind is becoming disordered becomes apparent when she is on her return journey. And she says that she becomes enmeshed in a network of turns unknown, and she reaches her bodily collapse. And she says that she recalls that she seemed to pitch headlong down an abyss, and she remembered no more. So Bronte leaves sort of the end of that section as a bit of a textual blank, really. Just as Lucy collapses, that's the end of the volume, and it's sort of built up to that point physically and mentally. I'm moving now to my third section, which is on treatment and diagnosis, and suggest how treating the mind and body is challenging. In an article entitled From Neurosis to Narrative, it is claimed that nervous illnesses such as hysteria and hypochondria bore a problematic relationship to the body because they lacked organic causes. And this is something which Dr. John picks up on in a conversation with Lucy, and she says how that she's experiencing low spirits, and he says, I can't treat you by a pill or potion because my art holds at the threshold of hypochondria. So I think he's identifying how without a biological cause it's very difficult to provide treatment, and therefore interpreting how for both the patient and the physician can be problematic. So what I hope has become clear is that though the use of pseudosciences, i.e. phrenology and physiognomy, support the notion that the material body and the mind are directly interrelated, the complexity of this interaction is made clear in discussions surrounding hypochondria and the difficulty one has, i.e. doctor, in treating an illness which is psychological, though manifests itself sometimes in physical ways.
You did a nice job of contextualizing, historicizing phrenology and physiognomy and so forth. Do you think that, so what you revealed was a way in which contemporary notions are evident and impact on a novel. Do you think the novel is at all, does it just simply receive those ideas, or do you think it's critical of those ideas at all?
The likes of phrenology and physiognomy.
Yeah.
I think in some ways it's showing how they can be highly useful, and I read an article that said that Bronte went to see a phrenologist herself, and so I think there was that personal interest in it, and she is interested in how interested in presenting it in her novels. I would say that although she says it can be authoritative, so that yes, by looking at somebody we can make inferences about their internal nature, I think we have to be careful about how far we take that and just how authoritative it is. And I think she suggests that by Dr. John's analysis of Lucy and that kind of thing.
I thought that was an extremely thought-provoking talk. I enjoyed that. Apart from the misplaced apostrophe and pseudosciences and the penultimate slide. But what you see, the quotations you had from those Victorian meditation on what it is to be a woman, and the link between illness and then kind of living a fairly useless life in a way. Mary Wollstonecraft says that 50 years before in the Vindication of the Rights of Women. It's exactly the same kind of this kind of attack on the feminine languorousness, etc., etc. My question is this. You said there were how many references in the book to physiognomy or
175, where not necessarily just Lucy, but characters would look at somebody and assess their character without them having actually spoken, but 5 of those where physiognomy was mentioned by name, so like the quotations that...
So how many of those cases are they kind of explicitly used as some kind of pseudo-scientific rhetoric?
I think...
All of them, or what percentage?
The ones, I assume the physiognomy was mentioned, it was very explicit.
Yeah.
On other occasions it was an observation that was made in a judgment of character. Maybe a conversation wasn't necessarily there, but a judgment was made nevertheless. And what I got from that was just, it sort of highlighted the idea of vision, because that's quite a big theme, and the gaze, and who's looking at who and why. And actually there's not necessarily verbal interaction there, but quite profound judgments are made about someone just based on how they look.
Can you say some more about phrenology? It's a topic I'm really interested in. But as a romanticist, when Gall and Spurzheim came over to Scotland in the first decade of the 19th century, they kind of really cut a dash, don't they? And they get these people who believe in them, this intense passion and the power of phrenological analysis. And then, but it's also greeted by a chorus of mockery and satire and caricature. So what do you think the Bronte's attitude was towards phrenology?
Well, when I was researching it, said that sort of mid-century there was a bit of a change. So whereas before and throughout the 18th century it had been developing, and people really took an interest in it and truly believed it as a science and would take their sort of judgments as absolute truth. There was a bit of a change mid-century, and as you said, people began to mock it and think, well, actually, how can this be the case? And are we making inferences about something which are not really justified? So I mean, this is 53. So I suppose maybe she's writing this at the point where people's perceptions of it are maybe a little bit more unstable than they would have been.
But she's not scornful of it.
I don't think she's
scornful
of it. No, I think the fact that she includes it in the novel, and she herself has been to visit somebody, obviously shows that there's a justified interest.
Yes, phrenology, say what you like about it, is kind of an important phenomenon, because it's one of the first times where people are thinking that the brain actually has kind of an impact on our character. And it's the kind of absolute certainty that this part of the brain is your organ of amativeness or whatever. But they were actually onto something, despite their this absolute conviction. They knew exactly, because the brain's a very mysterious thing even now.
Yeah, so despite that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.